Hello, welcome to the next session on epidemiologic approaches to causal inference. And in this session, we'll talk about graphical models. Graphical models are also known as causal diagrams. And if you look at literature, you will see references to various types of causal diagrams, such as path diagrams, influence diagrams, relevance diagrams, causal networks, directed acyclic graphs, etc. So basically, these causal diagrams or graphical models, they illustrate the qualitative assumptions that we make about the causal relationships between the exposure of interest and the outcome of interest and all the other variables or covariates that can influence the exposure as well as the outcome and amongst themselves as well. Causal diagrams help researchers to recognize and avoid common mistakes in causal analysis, more specifically such as the confounder adjustments or bias induced due to non-random selection of study participants. Causal diagrams also provide us with a united framework for evaluating the design of studies as well as the analysis strategies for any causal question under a set of certain causal assumptions. Let us now try to understand the structure of these causal diagrams. The causal diagrams are made up of a set of variables, and we try to show the relationships among these variables. Each of the variables is called as a node. So in the diagram that you see here, we have 4 variables or nodes: x, z, y, and u. X is our exposure variable and y is the outcome variable. U and Z are considered as covariates. So we have 4 nodes, and the lines that join one node or variable to the other is called as an arc or an edge. And here, what we see here are various arcs or edges. We have lines going from X to Z, Z to Y, X to Y, U to Z, and U to Y. We also need to understand how the various kinds of lines that we draw or the connections that we make between various variables, they again have a certain meaning in the context of causal diagrams. So if there is an undirected line between 2 variables, there's no direction or arrow here, then that represents that there is a correlation or association between, say, A and B, and not causation. In order to display or show that A causes B, we need to put an arrow or a directed line from A to B. If we had to show that B causes A, then the arrow would go from B to A. Sometimes you may also see in literature that there are double-headed arrows, there are, say, maybe 2 lines, or there is a dashed line between variables or nodes. And again, these are meant to show correlations or associations that may have been there due to certain unobserved common causes, or that may have been induced but not actually there. And that's what the dashed lines, for example, shows. That originally, say, for example, there's no relationship between A and B, but because of the way we may have selected the study participants or the way we did the analysis, etc., which we will talk about subsequently in the course, we may have induced an association between A and B, and that's where we make a dashed line. If there is no line or no connection between 2 variables, what that signifies is that there is no causal relationship between those variables, right? Or what we call as the causal null hypothesis. So if we have to show a relationship, whether it's causal or non-causal, between 2 variables, we need to draw a line. Now let us understand how some of the terminologies and which we use when we talk about the relationships between different variables within the causal diagrams. So one way we describe some of the variables would be as a parent variable. There could be child variables, and then there are endogenous and exogenous variables. So a variable from which an arrow starts or comes out and goes to another variable So that particular variable from where the arrow starts is called as a parent variable. So for example here, x is a parent of z, x is also a parent of y, and so forth. The child variable is the variable that happens to be present at the end of the arrow. So here y is a child of x, z is a child of x, z is also a child of u, and so forth. Then those variables which have a parent, which means we have shown some variables leading to that particular variable, those are called as endogenous variables. So in this example, y and z are endogenous variables because they have x or u as their parent. However, x and u are exogenous variables within the context of this particular causal diagram because we've not shown any other variables to be the parent or the cause of these variables. And then we have what are called as paths within these causal diagrams. So generally, when we talk of paths, what we speak of is the path starting from the exposure of interest going to the outcome of interest. So a sequence of these lines, edges, connecting two and other variables, starting from the exposure of interest and going to the outcome of interest, irrespective of the direction of the arrow. So at this point of time, we do not worry about whether we are going in the direction of the arrow or against the direction of the arrow. So in this causal diagram that you see here, we have three paths. We have a path from x to y, which is a direct path from x to y. There is a path from x to y going through z. So x, z, y is a path. And then we have another longer kind of path going from x to y, which is x, z, u, y. As I said, to describe the various paths, we do not take into consideration the direction of the arrows. What is meant by direction of the arrows is what we will come to. So if there are paths that go in the sequence of arrows, right, and not go against the arrow, then those paths are called as directed paths. So sequence of arrows such that the child in the sequence is the parent in the next step. And these directed paths basically represent our causal paths. So this is the mechanism that we are representing through which the effect of exposure is happening on the outcome. So here we have two directed paths in this particular diagram. One is xy, right, which is one path which is directed because you have an arrow going from x to y. And we have xzy. Again, that's a sequence. We are going from x to y in all the time in the direction of the arrows. The third path, which is xzuy, is not a directed path because when we go from x to z, yes, we are going in the direction of the arrow, but to go from z to u, we have to go opposite to the arrow. And hence, that is not a directed path. So here we also say that x is the ancestor of y. So again, another terminology apart from the parent and child is ancestor and descendant. So x is the ancestor of y is a descendant of x, y is also a descendant of z. And then, as I mentioned before, we have each node is a variable, and then we give each variable can be considered to be doing a specific function or have a certain trait or characteristic within the terminology of the causal diagrams. So as I said earlier, x is our x. So there would be one exposure variable if you are interested in one particular exposure. If you're interested in multiple exposures, of course, there can be more than one exposure variable. And then there is an outcome variable. Now, we talked of paths going from exposure variable to the outcome variable, and all the variables that come on these paths between the exposure and outcome are called as intercepts. So here, z and u are intercept variables between x and y. These intercept variables can have certain characteristics. So there are some of the intercept variables can be labeled as intermediate variables or mediators on that particular path. So the variable that intercepts a directed path is called as an intermediate or variable or a mediator. So here z is a mediator or an or an intermediate variable in the path x, z, y. But in the path x, z, u, y, z is not an intermediate. Here we consider z as a collider. A collider is a variable that on which a path enters as well as exits from that particular variable. It's sort of the collision of two arrows. So in the path x, z, u, y, you have an arrow going from x into z and you have an arrow going from u into z. So z becomes a collider on the path x, z, u, y, whereas z is also an intermediate on the path x, z, y. So the characteristic of variables as intermediates or colliders are path dependent, and they are not the overall general characteristic of that particular variable. So a variable could be a collider on one path and not a collider on another path. A variable could be an intermediate on one path and not an intermediate on another path. Based on the kind of paths that we draw between the various exposure and the outcome variables, we can have various types of causal diagrams. So a directed graph is a graph where all the arcs, all the lines that go between the various variables are arrows. And so those are called as directed graphs because the entire connections are in the form of directions and not just, say, straight lines and undirected lines. Then we can have what are called as cyclic graphs and acyclic graphs. So if you see in the graph represented by the variables a, b, c, d, e, f, it is a directed graph because all the arcs between the various variables are arrows. However, you can see that there is a kind of a closed loop that you can see from b, c, e, d, b, right? So arrow that starts from one variable and ends on the same variable through various other variables, right? Those graphs which have this kind of a structure are called as cyclic graphs. And since they have arrows, they are called as directed cyclic graphs. Then there are other graphs where there is no directed path which forms a closed loop, and there is no variable which is both an ancestor and a descendant of other variable, as you can see in the x, z, y, u graph. And these graphs are called as directed acyclic graphs. Both of these are kinds of what we call as causal graphs. And these are called causal graphs because every arrow here represents the effect of one variable on the other. Now, these effects can be seen as direct effects if there is a direct arrow between the exposure and outcome without going through an intermediate, such as xy in our example, or x also has an indirect effect on y through the intermediate variable z. So those are called, so the graphs can be used to represent both, can have direct if we are aware based on previous studies and what we know or from other evidences prior to doing that particular study, that yes, the variable can have directly influence the outcome or it can influence the outcome through other mechanisms. We can show both direct and indirect effects in the causal graphs. So let's look at an example here from a study that we recently completed of how we use these directed acyclic graphs. So this was a study to identify various risk factors for mucormycosis among COVID patients. Here, the outcome variable, which you see in the center to which all the arrows are coming into, is ROCM, which is the short form for rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis. So the fungal infection of the nose, the orbit of the eye, and the brain. Now here we were interested in to understand what could be the various causal factors that can influence the high prevalence of mucormycosis among COVID patients. And we saw that there was sort of the black fungus and the epidemic within the pandemic that we saw earlier. And so here, each of these, so we had multiple factors that we wanted to look at as exposures. So here we have arrows going, say, from hypertension, from hyperglycemia, from diabetes, use of steroid, use of oxygen, etc. Right? So those are the arrows that we drew from those exposures to the particular outcome. And then there were other factors that influenced these different exposures of interest. You have age, you have use of other drugs, comorbidities, etc. that were seen as covariates. And so we represented the relationship between all of these variables through the causal graph. And here, this is an example of a directed acyclic graph. And this really helped us to understand what are the variables that we need to adjust for in the analysis, what are the data that we need to collect for, and how we could understand the actual mechanism of how one exposure variable led to the outcome of mucormycosis. However, we know that, causal diagrams are really useful. They are visual models basically for actually distinguishing between causation and association, right? Which is the key problem that we have in making causal inferences, more so in observational studies, not compared to experimental studies, but this are used in experimental studies as well. However, they also have certain limitations in what we cannot understand or what we cannot derive from the use of causal diagrams. So they do not, so as I told you earlier, these are qualitative assumptions of the relationship between various variables, between the exposure and the outcome and the other covariates. So they do not tell us anything about how strong the association is between the exposure and the outcome or the other covariates. Secondly, we cannot quantitatively analyze what is the level of bias. All that we can identify, which we will see in some of the topics that are to come later on, is to quantify how much bias is there. So these causal diagrams can help us to understand what could be the reason for the bias or the confounding, but how much is that confounding occurring or how much is it affecting the quantitative estimation of the bias is not possible through these causal diagrams. And lastly, understand that there could also be interactions between the exposure of interest and the other covariates. There could be direct, indirect effects. And so these, the effect of interactions between the various variables is also something that is not possible, at least within the basic framework of the causal diagrams, to be illustrated or shown in the diagram. That is more of a quantitative problem, and we have quantitative ways to identify whether there are interactions. Thank you, and see you in the next session.